It began with a closed-door meeting in Washington, D.C., one that never appeared on any official calendar. The air inside the room was dense with cigar smoke and quiet urgency. A former intelligence officer, now turned economic advisor, slid a red folder across the mahogany table to a young senator who had just been ushered into the elite circles of power. The folder was marked, "Eyes Only, Bretton Legacy." Inside were documents, leaked cables, internal IMF memos, World Bank communiques, spanning 6 decades. What they revealed was not just influence, but control. The story traces back to July 1944. Amidst the ruins of World War II, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They were promised a new world order of financial stability. But in reality, the blueprints of both the IMF and World Bank had already been drafted, not in multilateral discussion halls, but in the strategy rooms of the U.S. Treasury. Henry Dexter White, the U.S. representative and co-architect of the Bretton Woods system, ensured that voting power within the IMF and World Bank would be tied to financial contributions. That meant the U.S., the largest contributor, would always hold veto power. From the very beginning, America designed the game and ensured it always held the dice. By the 1970s, the evidence became harder to ignore. When Chile's democratically elected President Salvador Allende began nationalizing industries and distancing the economy from Western dependence, the IMF quietly withdrew support. Not long after, a CIA-backed coup removed Allende from power. Documents declassified years later showed that IMF signals had played a role in choking the economy. A quiet siege with no bullets, just balance sheets. The story repeated across continents. In the 1980s, Zambia sought to build an independent economy after years of colonial exploitation. But when copper prices dropped and debt piled up, the IMF arrived, not with relief, but with conditions. These weren't simple suggestions, they were ultimatums. Devalue your currency. Cut public spending. Privatize state industries. The result? Schools closed, hospitals ran out of supplies, and foreign companies bought national assets for cents on the dollar. Back in Washington, those decisions were viewed as necessary structural adjustments. But in Lusaka, Harare, Buenos Aires, and Jakarta, they were called economic colonization. A former IMF economist turned whistleblower, Dr. Michael Carnes, described it as a velvet chain. Countries weren't forced to obey, but non-compliance meant economic isolation. "You either kneel at the table or starve outside the door," he said in an explosive 2003 interview, just weeks before his mysterious car accident silenced him for good. The deeper you go, the darker it gets. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis devastated economies across the region. Thailand, South Korea, and Indonesia saw their currencies collapse overnight. The IMF rushed in with loans, but again, with conditions. State protections were dismantled, labor laws weakened, and domestic banks sold to foreign investors, many American. Curiously, while US-backed IMF officials insisted on austerity abroad, they championed stimulus at home. During the 2008 financial crash, the US government bailed out its banks without IMF interference. But when Greece teetered on collapse just a few years later, the IMF demanded pension cuts, tax hikes, and fire sales of public assets. By 2019, over 60% of the IMF's loan portfolio was tied to countries that had, in one form or another, been strategic to U.S. foreign policy interests, either as allies, resources hubs, or military footholds. Whistleblower reports from World Bank insiders like Karen Chatterjee, whose memoir, The Loan That Broke a Nation, briefly topped bestseller charts before disappearing from bookstores, reveal that many loans were approved not based on economic merit, but geopolitical alignment. If you supported U.S. votes at the UN, your loan was fast-tracked. If not, your application gathered dust, or disappeared entirely. But the most shocking revelation came from Project Atlas, a secret internal audit leaked in 2021. It detailed how World Bank-funded infrastructure projects in Central Asia and Africa were subcontracted to U.S.-based firms without public tenders, with inflated budgets and kickbacks leading back to political campaigns and lobbyist firms in D.C. A pattern emerged. Every time a nation tried to escape the dollar's grip, a crisis, mysteriously, appeared. In 2011, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi pushed for a Pan-African gold-backed currency. NATO intervened, and the IMF quickly stepped in to stabilize the post-conflict economy, with loans tied to opening up oil sectors to Western companies. In 2022, when Pakistan flirted with turning to China's lending mechanisms over the IMF, an internal IMF memo, leaked but never confirmed, allegedly referred to the decision as a red line for maintaining regional stability. Even today, IMF voting power remains heavily skewed. The U.S. alone holds over 16% of the vote, giving it de facto veto power over major decisions, which require an 85% supermajority. And when countries have tried to propose reforms, to give more power to emerging economies, they're quietly blocked or watered down in backroom negotiations. The term puppet may sound conspiratorial, but when the strings are made of debt, policy, and international pressure, it's not hard to see who's really pulling them. And now, in 2025, a new wave is rising. Nations like Brazil, India, South Africa, and Malaysia are forming alternative financial alliances, resisting the IMF's influence and demanding transparency. But can they withstand the quiet force of economic warfare? Or will history repeat itself once more? Silent coups disguised as currency reforms, sovereignty traded for liquidity? Because in the world of global finance, the quietest wars leave the deepest scars. And behind every smiling photo op at IMF press conferences, behind every billion-dollar rescue package, lies a single question. Who is rescuing whom? The camera flashes and media smiles hide the tension simmering beneath the surface. In July 2025, at the IMF's annual general meeting in Nairobi, Kenya, a symbolic shift away from the usual Western host cities, leaders from over 90 countries arrived with one unified demand: vote restructuring. The African Union, BRICS Plus nations, and a coalition of Southeast Asian economies had prepared a joint resolution to democratize the power structure inside the IMF and World Bank. Their proposal: one country, one vote. It was the most direct challenge to U.S. dominance since the institution's founding. But as expected, the U.S. delegation, led by Treasury Secretary Margaret Langston, politely rejected the resolution, stating that contributions dictate responsibility. Translation: he who pays the piper still calls the tune. Yet behind closed doors, there was panic. Langston's private notes, later leaked to a European investigative outlet, admitted the U.S. could be losing narrative control as financial hegemony erodes. The dollar's centrality was being questioned, not just in theory, but in actual trade. For the first time since Bretton Woods, serious global players were betting on alternatives. The World Bank's internal analytics unit, Omega Risk Assessment, issued a red alert memo titled Eurasian Defiance. The document warned of a tectonic shift away from American soft power if upcoming oil trade deals in the Middle East moved fully to the Chinese yuan. The IMF may become irrelevant, it read. Worse, it may be exposed. But perhaps the most damning revelations weren't political, they were personal. Enter Agent Victor Estrada. A veteran of covert U.S. economic missions in Latin America, Estrada had operated in silence for decades, until he vanished in 2023, presumed dead in a plane crash off the coast of Belize. 2 years later, he re-emerged in Caracas with a flash drive. The files on that drive were known only as Operation Blue Dagger. They detailed dozens of covert U.S. intelligence collaborations with IMF staffers embedded in developing nations. Their mission: not to support development, but to monitor political loyalties, suppress anti-U.S. narratives, and guide economic policy in favor of American interests. In short, these weren't just economists, they were assets. One such operation in Sri Lanka showed how IMF reform demands conveniently aligned with U.S. military base negotiations. Another in the Congo redirected infrastructure loan tranches to companies with undisclosed U.S. defense contracts. Estrada's files also uncovered something even more disturbing: media manipulation. The IMF had quietly funded journalism programs and economic think tanks in several developing countries, masking U.S. foreign policy as objective fiscal advice. Articles in major newspapers, editorials by independent economists, even viral social media content, they were all scripted, sometimes directly from IMF internal memos. Public perception was being engineered. As outrage spread online, the IMF released a sterile statement denying any wrongdoing and labeling Estrada a fugitive hacker with ties to hostile states. Yet, no one could explain how he accessed classified staff emails, loan negotiation transcripts, and encrypted IMF comms. In the wake of these disclosures, protests erupted from Nigeria to Nepal. Protesters carried signs that read, Debt is the new colonialism. Loans today, chains tomorrow. IMF equals invisible master force. Back in the U.S., Congress held closed-door hearings on foreign policy via financial instruments. No transcripts were released. The president gave a vague statement about ensuring economic stability worldwide. But a rogue senator, Elijah Morton, broke ranks. In a fiery floor speech, he thundered, "We've used the IMF like a scalpel, cutting open other nations' economies, removing what we didn't like, then stitching them back up with strings tied to Wall Street. That's not stability. That's global puppetry." His mic was cut halfway through. Meanwhile, in a small office in Geneva, a woman named Amina Diallo was compiling the final draft of what would become a landmark report, the Sovereignty Audit. She was a former World Bank economist who had left in protest after her rural water project in Chad was quietly defunded in favor of a U.S.-connected mining initiative. Her report documented how 98% of World Bank-funded projects in Africa over a 30-year period led to foreign ownership of national assets within 5 years of completion. She didn't call it conspiracy. She called it pattern. And as her report spread, even former IMF loyalists began questioning the system. Leaks continued. Former officials spoke anonymously. Several resigned. But the true turning point came when Ecuador's newly elected president, Lucia Viteri, defaulted on all IMF debt. Her defiant address at the UN electrified the world. "We do not owe our children to foreign banks. We owe them a future. And that cannot be mortgaged." Immediately, Ecuador's currency collapsed. Sanctions followed. Trade routes tightened. Yet, a surprising number of nations began wiring direct aid, not through the IMF or World Bank, but through new South-South alliances. The U.S. response was swift and silent. Within weeks, cyber attacks hit Ecuadorian infrastructure. Anonymous shell companies began a smear campaign accusing Viteri of corruption. A motion to recognize her presidency as illegitimate began circulating in international bodies. But she stood firm. And then something incredible happened. Bangladesh canceled its next IMF repayment. Then Bolivia. Then Tunisia. And finally, an earthquake in the system. India announced it would form a rival institution, the Global South Cooperative Fund, backed by Brazil, South Africa, Malaysia, and even some EU member states frustrated by American pressure. Suddenly, the puppeteer felt the strings snap. In Langley, Virginia, a senior CIA analyst wrote in a memo, "We've lost the monopoly. Prepare for retaliation, this time, from nations we can no longer control." Because history shows us, once the puppets learn they are not bound by the strings, they don't just cut them. They burn the stage. The fire had begun. It wasn't the kind of war fought with missiles and tanks. It was a digital war, a financial war, an information war. A war where the battlefield was belief, and control of the narrative meant control of the future. The year was now late 2025. Inside a fortress-like building in Basel, Switzerland, the headquarters of the Bank for International Settlements, known quietly as the Central Bank of Central Banks, an emergency summit was underway. It wasn't just the IMF and World Bank that were trembling. The entire Western monetary order felt the quake. Representatives from the Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and Bank of England were in attendance, alongside a silent observer from the Pentagon. Why? Because they knew what few outside the room dared admit. The dollar was dying. The cracks began in trade. As more countries abandoned the dollar in favor of regional currencies, alternative blocks, or China's expanding digital yuan, the demand for USD plummeted. U.S. Treasury bonds, once the safest asset on earth, were being quietly dumped by major holders. Saudi Arabia and Vietnam shifted reserves. Even France began hedging its bets with yuan-backed instruments. The U.S. tried everything. Incentives, warnings, covert sabotage. But the tipping point was a single deal. In October 2025, Nigeria, Iran, and Indonesia signed the Global Energy Exchange Pact, agreeing to trade oil exclusively in a new commodity-backed unit known as the Earthmark. The Earthmark, backed by a basket of lithium, gold, water futures, and strategic rare earth metals, instantly gained traction in global commodity markets. It wasn't just an economic decision, it was a political declaration. We will no longer be puppets. Within 48 hours, U.S. financial markets wobbled. Wall Street's most powerful hedge funds suffered margin calls. The Dow dropped 3,000 points in a single day. Cable news screamed, "financial terrorism." But the truth was more uncomfortable. The IMF model had run out of victims, and now it was collapsing under its own weight. Inside the IMF, panic turned to blame. Board members leaked memos exposing years of internal dissent, ignored warnings, and manipulated country assessments. A top IMF auditor, whose resignation letter went viral, wrote, "We became judge, jury, and executioner for entire nations. And when they bled, we offered more loans, with sharper blades." Meanwhile, in South America, a movement was rising, a coalition of economists, historians, and activists known as the Debt Forgiveness Front. Their goal was simple but revolutionary: expose every IMF and World Bank loan ever issued, audit its legality, and cancel what they called odious debt, money loaned to dictators, stolen by elites, but still demanded from the people. Their most prominent voice was a Chilean historian named Valeria Ortega. Her documentary, The Paper Empire, released online to over 150 million views in 1 week, used declassified files, whistleblower interviews, and AI-simulated reconstructions to expose how nations like Haiti, Congo, and Ukraine had been systematically drained. One scene in particular shocked the world. In it, Ortega sits with a 92-year-old former World Bank translator who confessed that during the 1970s, entire country profiles were rewritten to favor pre-approved narratives. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we erased facts like one erases chalk on a blackboard. A single keystroke, and poverty vanished on paper. That's how we justified more loans." The fallout was immediate. Civil unrest ignited in several nations where repayment schedules were still enforced. Governments demanded reparation talks. Dozens of countries formed the Post-Colonial Economic Tribunal, a legal framework aimed at holding international lenders accountable, not just for financial damage, but for crimes against sovereignty. Facing unprecedented pressure, the World Bank tried to rebrand. It launched a new initiative called Humanity First, promising fairer terms, digital transparency, and decentralized oversight. But trust was gone. Too many lives had been lost, too many futures mortgaged. And in the United States, the reckoning had begun at home. A new movement, "Not in Our Name," surged across the country. Tens of thousands protested outside the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and IMF liaison offices, waving signs that read, "We built this empire. Now let's dismantle it. Freedom abroad means truth at home. No more puppets. No more strings." In Congress, a radical new bloc of lawmakers, half populist, half reformist, demanded a full audit of U.S. involvement in global financial coercion. They called it the Truth and Debt Commission. Their findings were explosive. Internal records revealed how lobbyists had influenced IMF country assessments, how defense contractors received World Bank contracts in conflict zones, how senators approved foreign aid packages conditioned on IMF voting compliance, how PR firms created fake social media movements in support of austerity policies. But it was the final chapter of the report that shocked even the cynics. It detailed an algorithm, developed by a U.S. defense contractor, funded by a black budget program, that could predict which developing countries would become desperate for loans within 5 years, based on climate risk, trade imbalances, and regime instability. The data wasn't used to help them. It was used to prepare extraction strategies. The document was titled, Harvest Protocol, Phase 4. Suddenly, it was clear. The IMF wasn't a puppet. It was the puppeteer. And America. It wasn't simply pulling the strings. It wove the strings into the fabric of global suffering, until the world mistook chains for support, until survival became servitude. But now, the strings were snapping. The silence was breaking. The puppets had found their voice. And so, as the dust of a collapsing order settled and the illusion of benevolence shattered, the world stood at a crossroads, no longer hypnotized by polished speeches or sterilized data sheets. The IMF and World Bank, once towering symbols of global unity, now faced the judgment of history as architects of modern-day empire. But from the ruins rose something rare and irreversible: awareness. No longer would nations trade their dignity for dollars. No longer would sovereignty be bought with interest. The age of invisible strings had ended. And in its place, a new era was born, not perfect, not without struggle, but finally, free.